good morning or afternoon, wherever you are in the world. I'm Stephen Henry Madoff, the founding chair of the Masters in Curatorial Practice at the School of Visual Arts in New York City. And this is a program, a 2-year program for training curators in every aspect of curatorial practice toward their career. And each week I host the Curatorial Roundtable, which invites distinguished curators and museum directors from around the world to speak about exhibitions that they've made. And today I'm delighted to have Professor Alexandra Melo, who I will read a short biography for. Alexandra Melo is Professor of Sociology of Art and Culture at ISCTE, University Institute of Lisbon, and a curator and art critic. Since the early 1980s, Alexandra has written for publications such as Jornal de Letras in Lisbon, Espresso in Lisbon, El País in Madrid, Flash Art, Milan, Parquet, no longer with us, unfortunately, in Zurich, and is a regular contributor to Art Forum here in New York. There's a long list of exhibitions which we've posted on Eventbrite, and I'm not going to go through the list. That would take quite a while in itself. But Alexandra has also been the curator of the contemporary art collections of the Ellipse Foundation and the Banco Privado for Serralves, and has worked as a cultural counselor to the Portuguese government. So with that, I will turn things over to you. Alexandra, thank you for joining us.
Hello, I hope you're having a good day wherever you are. I'd like to thank Professor Stephen Henry Madoff, for inviting me. It's an honor, and I'm very happy to share this presentation or conversation with all of you. I will start by presenting myself briefly, not my curriculum, but to explain a little bit what in my background makes me do exhibitions or curate exhibitions in a way that may be a little bit different from what professional curators now do as a profession. Then I will get into the general presentation of the main exhibition that we'll be talking about. How many worlds are we? I'll just speculate a little bit about what I mean by this question, how many worlds are we? Hopefully I won't speculate too much. And then I'll ask Stephen to show you some images. They're not very good, I'm sorry, but well, we'll make the best of them. And proceed to a brief presentation of each one of the artists, trying to explain how did I meet them, how did I get interested in them, and how did they fit into what was my intention or my inspiration. Finally, I hope we'll have time to make some remarks on each one of the artworks in the exhibition, and from there we can proceed to more speculation or enlarge our conversation. Trying to give a little bit about my background. It was already said, I'm a professor. I've been teaching at the University of Lisbon for 40 years. What we would now call cultural studies, sociology of art, theory of contemporary art, art criticism, art writing, well, all of those things. This means that my profession, the way I make a living, is by teaching at university. So I'm not just a freelance curator in the sense that I've never been attached to a particular institution, or I have never depended economically on curating more or less shows. So I'm not just a freelance curator, but the fact that I earn my living in another way allows me to curate in a way that I will, to use simple terms, may describe as being almost romantic. How would I put it? In a very simple way. Like I feel like my ideas for shows, or at least my best ideas for what I consider the best shows I've curated, they come from my life experience. My life experience, meaning, of course, everything comes from our life experience, but here I mean, especially traveling, going places I'm not so familiar with, going places that are not my cultural formative background, which is, of course, my being Portuguese, born and living in Lisbon, Western Europe, and the US, where I started traveling many years ago. So going to other places. And this feeling of not understanding, of willing to understand, to contemplate things that you've never seen before the same way, or interacting with people who have gestures, even languages, expressions that you're not so familiar with. Let's say that's what I call learning. It's like learning is, for me, paying attention to things I don't know, I'm not familiar with, listening to people and sitting around with people, not necessarily professors or intellectuals, but all the people in the streets, in the beaches, around the rivers and lakes, wherever. So that's my learning process. And that's where I believe came at least my favorite ideas for my favorite exhibitions I've curated. In this particular case, when I choose this title, How Many Worlds Are We? I can say the working title for the project was Far East, Far West. And the essay I wrote for that is in a book that it's called The Art Market in the Global South. But then in conversation with the Thai partners, they said, well, we're fed up with North and South and East and West, let's find something else. And so I took this idea that you are all familiar with of decentering, or we no longer live in a world which has one center and we can pretend to be in possession of this place, which allows us to have an overall view of the world. We know nowadays in the world, there are many worlds, many places who are centers of a point of view, who views the world as one thing. Even in the same country, there are completely different and opposite worldviews. And probably even within each one of us, there are different centers who allow us to have different points of views about the world. So that was the main idea. How many worlds are we? Me, you, a country, a continent, the world itself. Then my practical experience that drove to this particular exhibition was mainly in Brazil as a starting point, and Thailand as a starting point for some learning in Southeast Asia. I tried to be very constant, not to spend too much time, but in Brazil, my main interest was in the Northeast, namely the states of Bahia and also Pernambuco, and in the northern Brazil, mainly the state of Amazonas. As we'll see when we get to the works, I'm particularly moved by the relevance and the power and the beauty of the African culture that survives and is every day more powerful in Bahia, and from the traditional popular expressions of art and culture that originated in Amazonas, in the north of Brazil. To be even more specific, I was very interested. For 5 years, I went to the folkloric festival of Parintins. Parintins is the name of an island in the middle of the Amazonas River. And out of that, I made an exhibition in Portugal called Tauapaeira, which means mystical village in an originary native language from the Amazons, where I brought all the material, musical, choreographies, everything I had from the festival, and I proposed to some Portuguese artists to do something that would engage a dialogue with that and with myself. And so that was one exhibition that helped me come up with the exhibition we'll be talking about in a few minutes, I hope. As for Thailand, my relationship with Brazil goes 20 years ago. Back 20 years. With Thailand, I started like 10 or 12 years ago, because in a dialogue with a Portuguese film director, Joaquim Sapinho, we talked for hours and hours about all kinds of things, and we decided that it would be very interesting to do an installation at the Museum of Electricity in Lisbon. And out of this relation with that particular place, that is now a museum, MAAT, M-A-A-T, we decided to invite Apichatpong Veerasettakul, a Thai artist and film director who won a Palme d'Or in Cannes. From then on, there was a dialogue between the three of us. Apichatpong invited me to go to his birthplace in the north of Thailand. And from then, I developed a relationship with him and with many artists, curators, and people around him. And I spent a lot of time in Thailand, mainly in Bangkok, but also in the north, in Chiang Mai, and then in Cambodia. And from this, and I made an exhibition with Apichatpong and the other film director, Joaquim Sapinho, that was called Liquid Skin. Liquid Skin, this allows me to go into the two main subjects for the exhibition we're going to talk about. In more concrete terms, my idea, that's what I proposed in Bangkok, and I think that's what they find attractive, was to say, well, I think there are two subjects that may allow for a dialogue between artists and artworks now being made in Brazil and in Thailand. They were surprised because Brazilian art and artists are not that popular in Southeast Asia. And what I said, so well, what I see in common from my experience, not that it's the same thing, of course, but it allows for a dialogue, for a challenge, for a speculation, is the relation with nature, which, if we think about the Amazonas or Bahia, or the forests, or the river that crosses Bangkok, or the islands, the Thai islands, the relation with nature, with forests, with the water, all kinds of water, the ocean, the rain, the rivers, the sweat, well, you mentioned it, can be compared. Not compared, but we can establish some kind of dialogue or provocation. You may call it as you want. So that would be an issue. Nature, but not in an ecological perspective, because I don't have the knowledge to engage this kind of discussion, but in a more, if you want to make it simple, poetic way. The other element is what I could call spirituality, to put it in a very simple terms. To be practical, why? Why is that particular in Brazil or in Thailand? Because these are two situations, especially in the northern and northeast Brazil and in Thailand, when there is an unbelievable mix of religions, religious traditions, and cultural values and belief systems that apparently are contradictory, as we'll see with some of the artworks we'll present, but they function. So I would say that these are places where you can find a sense of spirituality that cannot be reduced to cultural wars or religious wars or strictly political wars. the realm of the spiritual. It's more complex than that. So this, I think, will be okay for now as a presentation of why I choose this title, How Many Worlds Are We? And why I choose nature and spirituality as two subjects that would allow me to speculate with the artists and with the artworks that we are now going to see and comment. So please, Steve, if you can show these two small films, and then we can start with the presentation of the artists.
Okay, can you see the?
Thank you. So this is the entrance to the the major. There are two galleries. This is the entrance to the bigger gallery where the exhibition was shown. This is a work by Vutlino, a Cambodian artist, and I'll talk about it later in more detail. This is a major big hanging sculpture by Tarblor, an artist, a Thai artist that lives outside Chiang Mai. This box and these three works on wood on the wall are by Tawat Chai, a Thai artist that also lives in the countryside near Chiang Mai in the north. Here we have a video and a small palm tree, which are two works by a Portuguese artist, Vasco Araújo. I will then talk about that. This is the box made by Tawat Chai, Putu Savasdi. Then I'll explain better how the box came to be. And these are, this is still Tawat Chai. And here you have the four works by Ayrson Heráclito, which is an artist from Bahia of African descent and initiated in Candomblé. And I believe one of the artists in the American territories that over a period of 30 years better has articulated this kind of tradition. You can see here in music and choreography with the contemporary art world to which he also belongs. But we'll get back to all of this when I make the presentation of the artist and the artworks. This big hanging sculpture, the artist says it's a space shuttle that comes from the future.
Okay, so do you want me to show the other?
Let me just say, yeah, about this box. I can, now that we have the image here, this box, when I met Tawat Chai, where he lives in the countryside, in the middle of nature, literally, everything around there, including his house, his studio, and everything, was handmade by him in wood, and he invented a kind of a personal cosmology. And he explained to me the starting point is this box. This is the minimum space that my body needs. So when you have all these sticks, it's like in his imagination, it's like his body is inside this box. These sticks give the measure of his body in the universe. And then he develops that into this kind of diagrams with very complex mathematical accounting, but all comes out of that. If you ask him, but what is this about? Oh, this is just about my place in the universe and measuring the place my body takes in the universe. So it's like a visionary. Well, maybe we may now see the other room. It's even more briefer film. Okay, so that was the entrance to the smaller gallery, Gallery 2. This is a film by Jonathan de Andrade from Northeast Brazil, The Fish. It's a film I actually first saw at the New Museum in New York. This is a triple channel projection by an artist, a Thai artist, Vantani Siripatananuntaku. It's a very, very special artist, but I'll talk about her and her work later. And this is by Yonamin. It's based on a traditional narrative from Northern Africa, and it also deals with the tradition of embroidery. This is a sculpture by an artist from Myanmar, Su Yanwe, and I'll talk about it later, but it's a masterpiece in ceramics. It's unbelievable. And this is a double mirror. I explain how it was made later by a Thai artist, Prachaya Pintong. So here we have a parrot, a river that's being destroyed by dams, and a white elephant. Then I'll tell you why this is meaningful. So now we can proceed, we can proceed to the presentation of the artists. I'll just show the portrait of the artist, and I'll say something more about him, about them. We start, I guess, with Ayrson, right?
Let me find
PDF.
the PDF.
After the text, we start with the
I have now lost it. All right, so I'm going to find it, and you keep talking while I find it again.
I can start talking about the artists. I already mentioned Ayrson Heráclito, as I mentioned, is for 30 years, he's been working he's a professor, is a curator, also an artist, and is what he calls initiated in candomblé. It means he's someone who has been articulating in his work for 30 years the contemporary art issues and debates with the rituals and objects and representations of candomblé, which is an ancient traditional religion that was brought by the enslaved people that European and Portuguese colonialism brought to Brazil. And it's really extraordinary, the power and the beauty of these expressions of this culture, like 500 years after the orders of colonialism. So I think it's an artist that I pay a lot of attention, and my conversation with him was very important to develop some of the issues and subjects on this show. Actually, I just wrote a review for Artforum about his retrospective at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Salvador, Bahia. We can move on. Jonatas de Andrade is an artist from Recife, in the state of Pernambuco, in the northeast of Brazil. And he became world famous with this film, The Fish. As I mentioned, I first saw it in the New Museum in New York, and then I followed his work very closely. I met him several times. We engaged in a conversation, and I decided to show this film, The Fish, in the exhibition because it had never been shown in Southeast Asia. And it's a very powerful video based on its knowledge, its experience with the fishermen that are there living fishing in the rivers of northeastern Brazil. Move on. Prachaya Pintong, it's the man who did this double mirror, which I will explain later, is someone who always, for each work he produces, he engages with a particular community, works with them, and then come up with a piece, sometimes a very simple, a very small piece. In this case, it's small but not simple. In this case, he engaged with a community in northern Laos, which is that region when there are hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of bombs that didn't explode. And so we work with a community that is trying to recover this metal to do something. And this double mirror in one side, it's that kind of metal recovered from the unexploded bombs that stayed there after the Vietnam War. And the other side is obsidian. It's a very special, precious rock. But we'll talk about it later. What is interesting with him is that he always does something in relation with the community in a place where he spends time. Go on, we go on. Soe Yun-Hue, unfortunately, I didn't have the chance to visit her because it's complicated to travel to Myanmar these days. But what is extraordinary in her work is the perfectionism of the ceramics. It's really extraordinary, as we'll see. And she deals in the sculpture issues with animals that are structural to the mythologies of Southeast Asia. Tawacha Puntuzavasdi, I already said something about him. What was the first time I visited him, what was more impressive, that he really lives in the country, by the countryside, and everything that you see, his house, his studio, his tables, his chairs, everything was handmade by him. And at the same time, he has this absolutely speculative mathematics about his position and the position of his body in the universe. So it's fascinating and quite original, not to say unique. Torlar is the artist who made this huge hanging sculpture that he calls a space shuttle. And what's fascinating, he also lives in the countryside. He was building a guest house himself. So it's in some aspect, it's similar to Tawachai, but everything he does is with found objects. It doesn't make objects. Everything, all that big space shuttle is done with old lamps, pots. You mentioned it, the most banal objects from everyday life, from domestic experience. And by talking with him, we can understand that it's all within his memories of his grandparents' houses and his parents' houses and the houses he had to destroy or that were destroyed. And so his approach would be like, take these discarded, despised objects from the past and turn them into objects that represent a utopian vision for the future, in this case, a space shuttle. This is a Portuguese artist, Vasco Araújo. He, for 20 years now, has been engaged in issues like race, gender, and in a very close relationship with opera. For example, he has made a piece about the girl from the Golden, because he's also an opera singer, not a professional one, but he studied as an opera singer. He did a video about the girl from the Golden West. He did a video about Benjamin Britten's video called About Being Different. And his most recent work that is not in the show, I'll talk about what is in the show later. It's called Carmen Troubles, where he gives voice, he goes and he hears and he establishes a dialogue between different Roma scholars and intellectuals discussing their readings of Carmen, the opera and the characters. In this case, he's presenting a video, and this palm tree, I'll comment later. Vut Lino, or Lino Vut, it's a young artist from Cambodia, and he was very, very important for me and my dialogue with him in articulating my relationship with other artists in Cambodia and with the Cambodian art scene, especially in Phnom Penh. He's the founder of Sasa Project, which is one of the most relevant, if not the most relevant or only contemporary art space in Phnom Penh. And I've been there a couple of times, and I realized there is a very alive and creative and happy, if we may use the word happiness in this context, community of artists from different areas like dancers, choreographers, musicians, visual artists. He's also very engaged with the LGBTQ plus community, which is under, like any political expression, under a lot of stress in Cambodia. So it is one of the artists with whom my dialogue was very important to structure the very idea of the exhibition. I'll later talk about the particular work he's showing here. Vantani Siripatana Nuntaku, it's probably the more unique and extraordinary artist in this way. She adopted as a companion, a life companion, an African gray parrot, which is there, and they live together, and she considers her as a companion, a life companion, and a working partner. So, for example, recently she presented a show at Frieze Projects in London, curated by Ruki Tiravanija, and the works were, most of them, signed by both Vantani and the parrot. The name of the parrot, and that's very funny, and it allows for a lot of speculation. If we have time, we can go there. She called her parrot Boys. So this is a choice of for her life and for her work as an artist, Vantani and Boys. I'll later talk about the particular video I showed. Yonamin was born in Angola, and he has lived in different countries in Africa, Angola, Congo, in Europe, Portugal, most recently in Greece. And his work always deals with narrative and language, both traditional narratives from the African tradition and popular language from street cultures in the big cities in Africa, like Luanda, or in Europe. So there is always an interplay and between the narratives relating to traditional histories from Africa and the very much alive language and invention of language in popular youth street urban cultures.
And that's you.
That's me. I've said enough.
Right. So should we go to images?
Yeah.
Or
Yeah, I think we could go to the images. This is from the opening, etc. And then at the end, if we have time, we can see the films again. So this work, I gave it a very important place at the entrance of the bigger room of the exhibition, the bigger gallery. So the idea, I asked the artist, this is a site-specific installation. He had already done it in another space. And here I asked him if he wanted to do a corridor, meaning that people who entered this space would have this possibility of going through the forest, like to suggest this forest as subject of the exhibition. Now, this work was done site-specific. These sheets of paper obviously represent leaves, green leaves, the forest. But under some of them, some dozens of them, there are drawings that were made by the artists in situ, in cooperation with many students from art schools in Bangkok. And all these drawings are about people meeting in parks, in public spaces, in gardens, mainly in situations, namely in Cambodia, where this kind of meeting, this kind of conviviality works as a site of resistance against repression, for example, for LGBTQ plus people or for political protests that cannot be like an open air protest, but people can meet in some gardens or places or whatever public spaces as sites of resistance. And also, he mentioned that some migrant communities in a particular city, they kind of choose a particular garden or particular place where they meet. Let's say they became spaces where they can keep and maintain the conviviality that is inherent to their communities as migrants, which is always like a discriminatory or discriminated situation. So it was quite spectacular because there was a fan, and when you go through this corridor, the leaves, the sheets of paper will float, will fly a little bit. This works by Vasco Araújo. The first, this is just a still from a video. The video, again, is about Roma culture, and we cannot see the video here. We don't have the time, but there are two men, an older man, an adult, and a young man, a child, an adolescent, that are walking in the desert. And they cross at some point, and we hear their thoughts about what is to be Roma, a people without origin, a people without a destiny, a people without a place. So there is a dialogue that becomes kind of metaphysical at some points about what it is to be a people like the Roma with no place. And what is interesting, and that's why I chose this video, is that somehow there is a strong identification, namely in Spain, of the Roma people with some aspects of the Catholic Church, namely this is the Virgin of Macarena in Sevilla, which is another example of a kind of hybridization, how Catholic images can be appropriated in different ways that depend on each one's point of view. The other piece, it's very funny. There are some headphones. If you put the headphones, you hear just this sentence: "Oh, it's so exotic. Oh, I'm so exotic. Oh, it's really exotic. I'm so exotic." And I think it's a very I love that I put it there, because it's a note of humor, but at the same time it shows in a very plain way that the very notion of exotic or exoticism is absurd, meaningless at the best. It can be worse, much worse than that. And this confrontation to having a Portuguese artist who has a palm tree that it's supposed to represent tropical spaces in Bangkok, a big, major, mega city, saying I'm exotic, puts this problem. What does that mean to be exotic? Well, it means nothing. Yeah. Well, I've already talked about this piece. I'll just tell an anecdote. The day it was very complicated to install this piece because it's hanging and it's quite heavy. And the day before the opening, it fell. It fall. So it was broken, and it had to be taken back to his studio, and then came back 2 weeks after. And in order to replace it, he did a small painting that is like an idyllic view of the countryside where he lives, and he wrote "Space Shuttle arriving soon." So it's a note of humor, and you have to find ways to manage with accidents. Well, I already explained this. So the first time I went to his place, he explained me, well, I start like I try to make my body take the minimum possible space, like if I was inside the box, and from then I make all the measurements, and then based on that measurements, it does all these other works, drawings and sculptures, which are always variations on what would be his body and the place of his body in the universe. It's a very naive but very ingenious and ambitious point of view. You can always see somewhere there is always a profile that then is distorted, and he makes geometrical variations on profiles that are basically always profiles of his own body. But the mathematics are really complex. I didn't understand them. Here, this is if there was to be a metaphor, a simple metaphor. Even metaphors are always risky, but this is called divisor or divisive, and it's an aquarium. This is from Ayrton Heraclito, and it's totally about the African culture in Brazil. It's an aquarium, and half of it is water saturated with salt, and on top of it there is palm oil, which is palm oil is used in African everyday cooking and in Bahia, and it's a material that he uses very, very often in his work. And of course, it calls it divisor because, and what does that mean? It means that when you say that these two realities mix, the salty water also being representing the ocean that enslaved people crossed to get to the Americas, you can say they mix, you can pretend they mix, but they don't. So it's like a very direct, if you want to read it this way, criticism of the idea of the melting pot and the idea of miscegenation that we can see as a form of perpetuation of colonial discrimination. This is one of the most awful images. This is images taken from a performance that he has done several in different occasions, and it's about the branding of the slaves by their owners. So it's I think we don't need I don't need to make any comments. That's it. Here, it's an example. Each one of these channels represents one of the elements of nature, and all the choreography and the sound that we can hear here are sounds from the traditions of the African people that has preserved those artistic expressions, both music and choreography, in Bahia. And those are some of the oldest dancers that still know how to perform these choreographies in a way close to what we can assume would be its original forms. So it's a triple channel projection. This is actually is a portrait of a young fisherman from the island of Itaparica, just across Salvador, but he has the objects and the other symbols that represent Logudede, which a very important entity, a prince in the ensemble of the deities from Candomblé. So it's like a prince of Candomblé. I could explain you, it's too complicated to explain. So it's just a fisherman from Bahia, but is represented as a very important deity from Candomblé. Finally, we go back to the film by Jonatas de Andrade, The Fish. So this film shows fishermen fishing in the rivers of northeastern Brazil. And what happens is when they catch a fish, they take it to their heart. And so there is a kind of cruel but very moving ambiguity in these gestures, because obviously they are caring and loving each fish, but at the same time they're killing it, which opens up this question of, so how is it possible to have a relation between man and animals and nature, which is loving and caring, but also involves violence? Well, I think that's it. I hope we have some time for some further speculation, but I give you Steve.
Right. So this would be a great time for people to put any questions or comments in the Q&A that's at the bottom of your screen. So let's see if anybody would like to ask Alexandra anything about the show. Let's give it a moment. How long did it take you, by the way, to prepare for this show? How many years of research and meeting with artists and so forth?
Well, it's as I said, my preparing is like living and sharing experiences with people. So I may say I met Ayrson 10 or 12 years ago. I met Apichatpong 6 or 7 years ago. In more practical terms, I made my first studio visits in Southeast Asia, in Cambodia and Bangkok, I would say 7 or 8 years ago. And in Brazil, well, I go to Brazil 2 or 3 times a year, so it's an ongoing dialogue. In the particular case of this exhibition, or this idea for an exhibition, it also started in a conversation with Ayrson and then Jonatas. In Brazil, it started with Vandani and then Prachaya and then Lino in Cambodia. So it would have started, if we measure in COVID time, it started 2 or 3 years before COVID. It was supposed to open the new Jim Thompson Art Center, the new building of the Jim Thompson Art Center, Contemporary Art Center in Bangkok in 2021. That everything was put on hold in 2020, and then we restarted in 2022, and it happened in 2023. So from the time I start talking with the artists until it happened, it's I would say at least 6 or 7 years.
Okay. So let's see, there is one. A couple of people have now written, Rosalind Murray. After such a long process making the exhibition, can you say what was unexpected for you in experiencing the exhibition finally? What did you come to know that you didn't know in the beginning? That's a great question.
Yeah. What was the most rewarding thing for me was that from what I felt, there was a lot of curiosity. Many people visited the exhibition. They asked questions. And even in interviews, some people would ask me, but for example, I can, it's a variation of that question, which is a very good one. And people say, well, but you think that you want to decenter your point of view, and you talk with artists here, you talk with artists there, but what do you get to know? How do you get to know? And I had to find an answer that is kind of an escape. And I said, well, what I get to know is from my shared experience of being with people, going with people to see places, to see the forest or the river or wherever they want to show me. And then sometimes even more than discussing issues that you can always discuss based on books or based on scholar university discussions, I stress a lot the way people interact, the gestures, the way people smile or don't smile, if they touch each other or they don't touch each other. How do they show respect? So as this kind of perception that comes out of the interaction with people and people in their places, both cities or nature, that's the way I feel I can learn something that I cannot learn from books and scholar discussions. So it's not a great knowledge that I can write a thesis about, but it's something that I incorporate in my life and in the conversations and experiences I will keep sharing with these artists and others. Actually, now I'm planning, and I hope I'll be able to bring the exhibition to Lisbon next year. And here I will engage other artists from Europe, from Brazil. Again, I will talk with the artists in Southeast Asia to see if they want to come up with something different or special that could make sense to show in Lisbon. So it's more about enriching my life and my human interaction than about learning in a scholarly way.
All right. So there are three more comment questions. The next from someone who hasn't given their name. The artists you have brought together are, in effect, transnational artists in their landscapes, like the African gray parrot. They've been placed in life terms by diasporas. Would you think of taking the conversation forward with the indigenous artists these lands to bring a new intersectionality?
Yeah, that's a very important question. And well, I take the opportunity. For some reason, I didn't develop the mention to the three-channel projection by Vantani, the artist who works with the parrot. So there were three elements there. Her interaction with the parrot, that is the basis of her work. They work together, and the river Mekong, that is being destroyed by dams built by the Chinese that are literally buying segments of the river, and then the white elephant that it's also in risk of extinction. And so there is an interplay with as the white elephant was used in diplomatic exchanges, and now just an anecdote. I saw in Laos a film that I didn't know existed called Chang. It is an American film, Chang, that was made in the 20s. I think it is the first time ever that what was then Northern Siam was seen in film. And it's exactly about the relation between man, elephant, and jungle. Now, to answer the question, the reason I don't let's put it another way. I think it's more fair for me to stay inside the contemporary art scene. That's what I know. That's where I can engage in a dialogue, hoping that some of the artists will bring me and open me other ways of establishing a dialogue, a deeper understanding of other cultures and other people that don't share this common territory of contemporary art. And it's like saying, I won't feel comfortable to ask this artist, for example, Ayrson. Okay, he invited me to go to make homage to Yemanja on February 2nd. So we give flowers to Yemanja and Oshun. And that's something that all the people of Salvador does, independently from being Catholic or Candomblé or whatever. So he invited me and I went, like everyone goes. But I never asked him to take me to watch religious rituals, because I don't think it's correct. That's not the way it works for me. The same thing with the people who live in the Amazons. I talk with people who live in Manaus, who live in small cities. I don't feel comfortable into going into the middle of the deep forest to try to establish a dialogue. I think that will be artificial. That will be, in a way, pretentious or preposterous. I hope these contributions will come to us and they will be brought by themselves. They who can really bring these words and these images and these ideas to the conversation, not my going fishing or hunting around, because I don't have enough knowledge. I don't have enough real common ground to do that in a way that would make me feel comfortable.
Okay. All right. So the next from Dr. Naval Scholars. How do you negotiate the spiritual, that is sacred initiation, with the public space of representation? I think I'm editing the question. Is this regarding African-centered religion and culture?
Yes, that is a very important question, and is being discussed right now in very practical terms in Salvador, in Bahia. Well, let's say, me personally, I didn't have to negotiate, because I give the space and the voice and the choice to Ayrson, to the artist. So he showed what he decided to show. He told me what he decided to tell me. He invited me to see this or that he decided to invite me to. But there were a very complex problem about Pierre Verger. So Pierre Verger is the great photographer. For decades, he worked in Bahia, and he took photographs of all. It's like the most exhaustive, it's the most rich archive related with Candomblé and African traditional religions in Bahia. And recently, there was a major retrospective of his work, and the curators, obviously, or maybe not so obviously, tried to show as much as possible, and many photographs that had never been shown before. And then there was a problem because some artists, curators, or some people involved with Candomblé said that that could not be. Some of these photographs could not be shown publicly because he was allowed, the Pierre Verger was allowed into those spaces because he was in a stage of initiation that will make it possible and for him to see and to be there and eventually to photograph. But those images are not supposed to be shared. Let's say for us, if we see the photographs, we don't see any particular difference. Well, okay, that's because basically we don't understand nothing because we don't have the knowledge. But for them, that was very important. And that I think they have to be withdrawn because this was, he was able to make this photograph. He was allowed to do it, but because he shared the condition that would allow him to do that. But he cannot, these images cannot be shared with everyone. So it was a debate because from a curatorial or museum point of view, it's the work of Pierre Verger. We want to have it in our archive. We want to see it. We want to study it. Should we go for this approach, or should we respect that those images are not for for everyone to see? It's an ongoing discussion. I don't know what is the point of this debate right now.
Okay. And the last comment is from Nat, which is just really a compliment. This is an extraordinary show. It's also interesting that it addresses culturally specific rituals, yet shown together speaks to the outward perceptions of these rituals. As always, these presentations are generous for having the curator speak about their intentions and projects. Thank you, Alexandra. So there's that. And
so now I must say thank you all. It was a pleasure to share this conversation with you. I hope you enjoyed it. And good luck. Be happy.
All right. Thank you so much. And Alexandra, we'll see you on the other link now.
Thank you. Bye-bye.